strongly recommend that you go and watch those two short videos, especially that absolutely fascinating one by the Ritz-Carlton to advertise their Waikiki property, which has now actually been built. It's one at the interface of Kuhio and Kalakaua down there in Waikiki. Because it really is absolutely fascinating that from the aspect of Ritz-Carlton, their purpose was to sell property. And they figured the best way to sell a property when you haven't even built anything on it, you don't even have an architect's rendering of what the inside of an apartment would like. So people are going to be dropping anywhere from $1 to, I think it's $27 million for a condominium without a clear idea of what they're getting. And what you do is this video was seen as a way to attract that customer, that very particular customer, and won a fair number of awards when it came out. It was very successful at its job. And in fact, the Ritz-Carlton sold all the units, including the high-end ones, in their property before they even started construction. So it's a fascinating example of the power of conspicuous consumption and then how it plays, with what we would think of normally would be a fairly practical decision. You're going to drop $3 million, we'll say, on a 2-bedroom condominium in Waikiki, but you're going to do it based entirely on a little over 2-minute presentation of stuff, none of which actually shows, there's not a single image that actually shows you where that place is located, which is really it's just a fascinating little video when you put the context of it. Okay, so to move on and try to sort of finish this part up. Peasant concept. Peasant is a real easy word. It's oftentimes misused, but again, just like Marx's production of labor, it's very specific in terms of what it's talking about. Peasants have nothing to do with people like uneducated or something like that. A peasant is a person who works property that they do not own. So if you want to think of them, peasant is a renter. They're renting the property or they're allowed to stay on it. Now, traditionally in much of European society, for example, right into really very recently, most folks were peasants. So this was a big issue, for example, in England in the 13 through the 1600s, was the fact that a large part of the population, through various means, had basically become disowned from the land that they'd had. So they were living on property. And at some point in the past, they probably actually owned it in the sense, or at least it belonged to their family. But at some point that had happened, it disappeared. It goes into the head of the landlords, usually nobility. And then, if the nobility decided to change the way they wanted to do stuff, which is what happened in England, then basically huge numbers of people were thrown off the property. And it's, when you think of the modern image of the English landscape, rolling hills and sheep all over the place and stuff like that, that all used to be villages. There's over 1,000 abandoned villages and towns in England that were all abandoned in the 16 and 1700s because the landlords decided that raising sheep and getting wool made more money than having people living in villages farming for them. And they could just basically give you a notice and say, get your butt out of here by next week. So the peasant concept would be the same idea as when you're renting an apartment or something like that. You have no, and traditionally most times you have no rights. The rights are entirely held by the landlord or the person that owns the property. It says something landlord, in the sense of the lord part. It's actually a very old term in American, or I should say in English. So peasant concept is a very particular type of population. Now, in much of the world right into the 21st century, peasants still exist. The majority of population in most of Mexico are peasants. The majority of population in much of the Philippines are technically peasants. Large parts of many societies, especially in Latin America, large parts of the population do not have ownership of property. Something Americans are oftentimes shocked about when they first hear it. They just sort of assume that everyone has the ability to own land. So therefore, if you don't own land, it's because you're too lazy or you're just clueless or something like that. Whereas in the reality, in many societies, there's no way you can get property. It's all held in the hands of very, very few people. Brazil is probably one of the most famous examples right now with the whole mess that's going on there. Now, one of the side effects, and this is something anthropologists have been involved in a lot, is this idea of what's oftentimes called the culture of poverty, which is a particular concept. It sort of goes like this. We'll say we have person A over here, and they're living in a group of 3 or 4 families. We'll say Mexico, why not? Since most of the property in Mexico is owned by less than 30 families. So these guys all live in a village together. And person A decides that what he's going to do is he's had enough of this. He's going to basically, right now, he doesn't own the land he works. So he and all of his buddies, they just sit there and work as much as they have to. They make enough to get by. So sort of subsistence agriculture. They give the surplus to the landlord, and that's how they pay their rent. So that's how they stay there. But they've been doing that, for since the mid 1500s, since 1600. So for the last 300, 400 years, they've sort of subsisted in sort of, same old system. It's become normal, and everyone thinks about that as a normal way things people are. In fact, in many cases, they don't really think about the fact they don't own the property unless something drastic happens. So they live in a house that they've lived in for, generations in many cases, and next to their friends or neighbors who have lived there for generations next to them. But they don't own the property. The property is owned by someone somewhere else. So let's say that, I don't know, this person A has been watching too many YouTube videos or something like that. They decide, to hell with this. What I'm going to do is we're going to work really hard on my land with the money that I've saved. In other words, what I'm going to do is I still have to pay taxes on it. But now I'm going to work hard, so I'm going to have a surplus. I'm going to sell that surplus in town. And with the money I make off of that, I'm going to go and send my kid to a good school so the kid can get a good education and will never have to work on a farm anymore. They can go and live in a city and have a better life than I have. Okay. Now, if you visualize it for a second, so we've got this guy here going to do this. Now, we'll say he's got 3 friends over here. They'll live next to each other. First off, let me ask you, why are these 3 folks going to be really pissed off at him for wanting to do this? See if anyone comes up with an idea here. Okay. Secondly, why is this actually a bad idea for him to do this? Now, if you just walk through this for a second, remember this scenario. Think about it for a second. He starts to work harder on this piece of real estate. His family's worked this piece of real estate for 300 years, we'll say. His friends have worked the properties next to him, which are all sort of the same for the last 300 years. So everyone's doing the same old. You get up in the morning, you farm, you go to bed. You get up in the morning, you go to farm, you go to bed. So everything's been the same. Now he immediately he's going to shift the status quo. So he's going to work harder. Now, if I'm the landlord living in Mexico City or some other place, what I'm going to hear pretty quickly is, oh, so-and-so, person A here is actually, working really hard, and they're able to pay not only my taxes, but they've actually taken money into town. They're actually taking stuff into town and making money off of so they can send their kid to school. Now, if I'm the normal landlord, not sort of like a Disney type landlord, think about it for a second. What's going to be my natural reaction to the fact that he's growing more and making money off of it? I'm going to raise his rent. All this time, I'm going to think, all these are like shifty buggers, and they said, we're working very hard. Now look, see here, this guy's actually working harder, which means there was always more money to be made off the land. If they'd worked a little harder, then they could have made some money. That means I should get more money because it's my land. Now, not only am I going to hammer him, but I'm going to raise the taxes on his 3 buddies, or the rent on his 3 buddies. Why? Because they could have worked hard like him and made more money, and so therefore I could make more money. So these guys are going to get their butts handed to them. They're going to get hammered because person A decided he was going to try to get the way out of it. And what happens is the rent increases on all of them, and he's not going to be able to send his kid to school because all the money he has to pay per month goes up. So he doesn't have any money spared. And now his 3 neighbors are really in a hard time because now they got to work extra hard just to keep the places they've had for generations. Okay, this is what we call the culture of poverty. And you see this in a lot of societies. You see this in a lot of Latin America. You see a lot in Southeast Asia. The Philippines and Indonesia are 2 perfect examples. And you've got a situation where if you stay there, there's no way you can get ahead, because the minute you try to get ahead and to make more, the person that owns the property is going to dump on you, and they're going to take that extra. You're not going to get to keep it and spend it. And so in that situation, you do basically, if you really want to if you want to give your kids a better life, there's only one way you can do that: is get your ass out. Okay. So culture of poverty results in outmigration. It can either be legal or it can be illegal, but it's generally your only choice. And this is something that Americans just do not seem to understand. The economic and conditions of land ownership in much of Latin America mean that illegal immigration to the United States is the only option that a lot of people have. A very similar situation much in North Africa is why there's so many people moving to places in Europe. Why? Because there's no way they can get ahead in the world that they exist. It's systemically designed to take advantage of them. And working hard just means you get punished more. Working hard does not result in some sort of gain. So this is what we call a culture of poverty. And a fair number of anthropologists have this as sort of their career to try to work on ways to change this. But again, you know, it's incredibly difficult for all the changes in government in Mexico over the last 150, 200 years. You still end up with the same small group of elite families that control all the land. Why? Because they're not stupid. They realize very quickly if something changes in the system, then they're going to suddenly, you know, be persona non grata, and they're going to lose all their power. The only time this happened in a spectacular way would be in China. This is what happened during basically the development of the People's Republic of China in 1959. You execute between 5 and 15 million landlords. You erase private land ownership from the entire society. It's now popped back. But for a good 40-something years, you had no idea of private land ownership. And you got rid of the culture of poverty, which was a huge issue in China for the last, you know, 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 years probably. So you don't get rid of cycles of poverty, because cycles of poverty aren't really accurate. It's a whole structured society. It's a systemic thing in the society where a small group, for various reasons, has basically gotten a position to control over everyone else. And one of the side effects of this, in many societies, people don't have a tradition of owning a house or owning land. Your general attitude is, I want to survive till the next generation, but I'll be lucky if that happens. It's sort of the way they view the world. They don't view the world as, you know, having stuff like that. So in their view, conspicuous consumption is generally not going to happen, because if anyone sees you that owns property and sees you as a peasant with conspicuous consumption, they're just going to tax you more. They're going to make your life ever more miserable. You can't win in a culture of poverty structure, which is the peasant concept, which is oftentimes why these end up as pretty massive, incredibly bloody wars, by how this is usually sorted out. One of the sort of really interesting ways that you see economics used, this is very typical of the Pacific Northwest. It actually occurs in a lot of societies. It's actually fairly common in a modified form here in Polynesia. Here in Polynesia, clans / families are really competitive with each other. And one of the ways that you compete in a world where you can't compete with violence anymore, and this is also true in the Pacific Northwest, is traditionally you competed by killing people or beating them up severely, and basically then had bragging rights. My family's better than your family. But in much of the world, you really can't do that anymore. And so what you find as a replacement of that is that you use the idea of reciprocity as a form of warfare. Now, if you remember, when you go back to our reciprocity, so there are 3 types: generalized, balanced, and negative. The one that you want to use here is a combination of generalized and balanced. Potlatch in various forms is really common in much of the Pacific, in both in Melanesia and Polynesia. Micronesia, I'm just not that familiar with. Most of Micronesia, I'm not sure. I would assume it probably was. I'm not sure if it still is. But here, for example, in this part of the Pacific, or the Western Pacific, it works like this. Person A decides, or I should say family decides, that they want to prove that they're better than family B. Now, you can do that by beating them up, but that doesn't work anymore. You're not allowed to do that for religious reasons or political reasons or whatever. So now what you do, if you have to find another way to prove you're better. So what you do is you use balanced reciprocity. Now, if you remember, balanced reciprocity is the idea of equity. I do something for you, you do something back for me. So family A gets all their relatives together. They have all their relatives cook food, you know, make things, whatever it is. Then they invite family B and family C to a party. Family B is the one they want to sort of take out or prove the superiority to. Family C is probably related to family A. Maybe they're related to clans or something like that. They're going to be there as sort of impartial observers. If you want to think of it, they're the equivalent of reporters. You want someone to tell the story of what happens to the general community outside. So for whatever reason, family B accepts. Maybe they can't say no. They come to this party, the ceremony. Family A not only feeds them for free, but family A gives them all sorts of stuff. So when family B leaves, they're lugging all this junk with them. Now family A is actually poor as a result of that. They lost the food. All the stuff they maybe spent the last year making is now gone. It's all with family B. Family C gets a little bit of stuff, but they're mainly there to watch what happens and report it. So you had this, you know, by family A standards, you have this really good party, all the stuff is gone, and family B's left just lugging all the stuff behind them. Now, one level in the American context, excuse me, it would seem that family A lost. They're out a bunch of stuff. But if you think about balanced reciprocity, family A now has family B in sort of a big set of IOUs because I put family B in a situation once they accepted all that stuff. Family B has to somehow repay them. Now I'll say that family B, for whatever set of reasons, can't. They've fallen on hard times, maybe. They don't have enough money, or they don't have enough resources, maybe they just don't have enough people. So now that the party's done, family B, who always thought maybe that they were better than family A, realizes that now that the party's finished, they've got all this stuff, they can't repay it. They'll try by repaying part of it, so they'll throw a party for family A, but then there'll be some other observer group, family C, that goes, wow, you know, these guys always talk up a big story, but that party was really lame. There wasn't a lot of food. They didn't have a lot of stuff. They sure didn't repay what family A had done for them. This is what we call potlatch, ritualized economic warfare. Family A has achieved the same thing as beating the crap out of family B. They've done it by virtue of beating them into submission by giving them stuff. Very common all the Pacific. This is how families do apologies, for example, or various other type of things in most of Polynesia. You give things. In the giving, there's a very strong concept of balanced reciprocity. So if the other group can't pay it back in terms of balance, then the imbalance is in status and prestige. Family B has to accept that family A is superior because family A was able to outdo them in terms of stuff. And that's what family A wanted. They weren't out to get family B. They weren't out for a party where family B pays them back. They don't want family B to pay them back. What they want is the status and prestige of being more successful than family B. And by having family C around to report on all this, that's now been publicized. And now everyone knows what's the more important family. That's potlatch. Very straightforward. If you're ever involved in, I've been involved in them. They make a lot of sense. In the American context, they were oftentimes punished. With Native American groups, including some friends of mine who are part of the Tlingit group in northern Washington State, Canada. Both the American and Canadian government made potlatches illegal from the late 19th century right into the 1970s because they saw it as a waste of money and resources. In their view, families were giving stuff away. And in the American context, you're supposed to keep it. So they actually made these illegal. And I remember long time ago, actually running around the countryside in northern Washington State with the amphibies, the FBI following us because we were bringing stuff to a potlatch. And the FBI was trying to, bust everyone for it because reservations are all federal land. Very bizarre. It's now legal. The Canadian government still discourages it, and the American government still heavily discourages it. But if you're part of the groups that do it, how else are you going to get status and prestige? No one's impressed with what you have. People are only impressed when you give it away. So balanced reciprocity and stuff can actually be part and parcel of the same thing. Very different than what American perception is, but nonetheless, not at all uncommon. A lot of societies practice something like this. Chinese tend to be very good at doing this too. The idea of a formal party. Okay, let's look at colonialism. And through the miracle of the pause button, here's this absolutely superb piece of art that sort of explains part of this. So we're going to use the British as an example, since one, they're an example I'm familiar with, and two, they're a real good example. Here's the English over here. So this is Britain, the UK, I don't know what everyone calls it. English is probably the best way to think of it. So the British in the 1700s start moving into India for trade purposes. They start trading with the various, Indian rulers, princes usually. And over time, because they don't trust the Indians don't trust them, as the British start end up taking things over. And the reason they can do that is militarily and sort of organizational ways, but generally militarily, they're superior to the Indians. So the British can go in and beat the local guy up and take over his property. So what they do over time is by the early 19th century, they've taken over the entire subcontinent of India. And when you think about it, it's absolutely insane because the British are this really tiny little, piddly group on a set of islands. And India is this enormous part of the planet. It's, even then it was like 1/5 or something of the world's population. So here we've got is literally at the height of the British Empire when they controlled India, I believe was something statistically was something like 1 British servant for every 30 to 50,000 Indians. So the British, India ended up as part of the British Empire. This is classic colonialism. Now it's not quite the same thing that was going on here. That's a modified version of it. This is classic. So what the British do is they now control India. They bring in the British legal system. This is controlled by the British military. Trade and everything's controlled by the British. And most importantly, if you want anything that's been manufactured, and the classic example is cloth. So among other things, if you're in India and you want to wear cloth or make clothes out of cloth, the cloth's going to all be ruled in here in England. Now, because they control India, they can tell everyone here, this is what you're going to do. This is how the rules are. This is the way the system works. Among other things, we don't understand your languages, so you guys are all going to learn how to speak English. As a result of that, this is what they want from India. What they want from India is raw materials. Now, what they also want is really, really cheap labor. And because they control India, the folks in India have no say in the entire situation. The entire thing's decisions, all the choices are made by this little group of people in this goofy group of islands called England. This huge part of the world's population just starts to suck up and deal with it. That's classic colonialism. No one's interested in what these people have to say about anything. Now we end up in the 20th century, and there's various protests. The most famous one of Gandhi was, this is why Gandhi's protests, where they had spindles, or whatever they called it, you actually make thread out of. And what they were doing is his form of protest was to have people in India start to weave cloth, which the British couldn't allow, though it made them look silly, because the British basically had said, no, the only cloth you can buy is cloth woven in India. You guys grow all the cotton to make the cloth out of, but you're not allowed to have thread. You're not allowed to actually weave cloth. That's done by these guys, so that all the British guys can have big factories and make lots of money, and they have a captive market, because if you're in India, you have to have cloth, and if you have to have cloth, it has to come from England. So everything's for the benefit of these guys. No one's interested in what's in it for them. Okay, that's colonialism. Now, at some point, what happens is, in the case of England, this occurs in the 1940s, end of World War II. The British decide that this is too expensive. The amount of complaints and the amount of revolts these guys have done to get out has made them embarrassing. So the British just say, we're tired of this. We're out of here. So the British leave. Now, at this point, they'd controlled most of India for exactly 100 years. In that period of time, they'd industrialized this place. And this is why if you still go to India today, they drive on the British side of the road. They tended to fairly recently buy British cars. The motorcycle I wanted to buy, called Royal Enfield, is made in India, but the original motorcycles, Enfield was originally a British company. So in the 1930s or whatever, they shipped the factories over to India because of the cheap labor and started building the motorcycles there. Now the only place they're built now is in India, but they were British motorcycles. The heads of the Indian court system were invariably trained at universities in England, even today. If you're successful in India, you generally have gone to British schools. The second phase is what we call neocolonialism. The British no longer control you militarily. They no longer control you politically. But because for over 100 years they've run you, they still basically control huge parts of your legal system, for example, is based on theirs. The idea of the judiciary is based on theirs. Even the Indian parliament is based on the British model. So everything from the way that you do the streets to everything like that is a reflection of this period of control. So the British aren't in control politically or militarily, so it's a lot cheaper for them. But in some ways, they're probably making even more money off of the folks in India, because everything that's specialized or unique or different still comes from England. That's neo-colonialism. You don't have the military, you don't have the political control, but you get all the benefits that you had when you had that. Okay. Now, the reason the Indian case is so interesting is then what happens is you end up with the third part of this, which is post-colonial. And it's been sort of ironic, what sort of goes around comes around. Because what you find in the 21st century is India is now the place where you not only grow the cotton, but now you weave all the cloth that someone in England wears. And the factories that make that into clothes are all in India. So this has now been completely reversed. Now most of your manufactured products go from here to there. If you have a call center, If you're an English company making, you have software apps or something like that, it's almost invariably what you're going to find is the people answering the phones are actually here in India. So a huge number of the jobs that were in England have now moved to India. Why? Because these folks all speak English, because guess what? For 100 years, you made them speak English. So in many cases, what you find is the system's now been reversed. Now, if you're going to buy a motorcycle, for example, you're going to buy an Enfield motorcycle, which are really popular in England, you have to buy the ones made in England. Why? Because the factories in India, because the factories in England all shut down. It's a British motorcycle company, but it's entirely based in India. Okay. So, you end up with a sort of a mirror situation where it's reversed itself. That's called post-colonial. Post oftentimes means after, but notice how these folks still have a relationship. It's not that they said, oh, no, it's like a divorce. I never want to talk to you again. There's still an economic, political, social relationship where the politics and military and stuff like that are more complicated because they're now both independent. But they still interact economically with each other. So that's now in many cases been reversed. So that's colonialism. It's the three versions are radically different because they're different ways or different parts of the same process. But the most important might be the post-colonial and the colonial, because in many ways they're the flip. The place that was being dominated now is actually a dominant force. The place that was the dominant force is now being dominated. So three different forms of colonialism. Colonialism here in Hawaii was sort of an indirect one until 1899 when we became part of the United States, and then it became formal. Under the monarchy, we were not a colonialized area. Unlike anywhere else in the Pacific, colonial belonged to someone, the British, the French, or the Germans, pretty much. So we were unique in that regard till 1899. And notice how we moved from economics to politics. And there's not really, like I said, there's not really a way to parse them separately. One of the important things to remember is when you're looking at, in the same way that economics is the movement of goods and services from those that have it to those that need it. Another important, real simple definition, which is the basis of politics. Politics is nothing more than the ability to compel people to do stuff. Now, it can compel an individual, compel a group, or whatever, but politics is the ability to make someone do something that's not what they would rather do. Okay? Now, if you want to put in the context of the United States, if you guys have a private company, that's a rather depressing thing. You usually find out very quickly if you have a private company that for the first 28 weeks of the year, in other words, half of the year, all the time that you're spending working is to pay your state and federal taxes. So half of the year, all you're doing is paying various branches of government. And they can make you do that because if you don't pay those taxes, they're going to arrest you, throw you in prison, and that's it. You got no company anymore. So you don't have any choice. That's just what it is. So politics is the ability to compel groups or parts of the society to spend their time and energy on something. That's the decision made by the folks that are in charge of the political system. Doesn't matter whether you're talking about kings or a Matai in terms of a chief or whatever. Politics is politics. The way it's presented and the way it performs differs from society to society. But as far as we can tell, politics has been part of the system in terms of the human species for a really long time. Why? Because we work in groups, and groups need to have some sort of decision-making process. They can't argue everything out because they die of starvation. It's almost invariably, you see this with our relatives. Macaques and baboons have very complex political systems. They're very intricate, usually matrilineal. But if you don't follow them, you get the crap beat out of you right there on the spot. That's their way of compelling that you pay attention, because the group will literally just beat you until you say, okay, I'll do what you want me to. So politics vary tremendously in terms of how it happens. But what it is really straightforward. Okay? What you find is oftentimes part of politics, this is very, very true here in the Pacific, especially in Polynesia, is that you can have politics not necessarily by keeping stuff. So think of conspicuous consumption, where you try to acquire more and more and more. A billionaire versus a millionaire. You can also get it, as we saw with Potlatch. You can get power and status by virtue of giving things away. That's what chiefs did here. The Makahiki period, which oftentimes now is sort of interred as sort of a combination of sports and playtime, It was actually a period of time where Hawaiians were really unhappy with this place. Because if it's the Makahiki and this is Palolo, what happens to the high chief, the guy that runs this area, marches through Palolo Valley with his retinue, which includes the guys that in their heads actually know everyone in the valley. So if you would, they had walking computers. That's one of the things Tongas did. He also has his soldiers or enforcers along with him. So his enforcement branch. And what he does is he makes his tour all the way up and down Palolo Valley. And as he stops at each house or each group of people, the guys, the Tongas that are in charge of that knowledge, basically recite who lives there, how many people are there, and what they owe the chief. And so as he's moving through the valley, and then of course the soldiers, the guys with weapons, they're the enforcers, are there to make sure that you pay it. And so what happens is you're going through the valley, everyone who owes their stuff follows you. So as he's going through the valley, you end up with this ever longer sort of, line of people following the chief. And so by the time he gets back to the front of the valley where, the ceremony is going to be held, the entire population of the valley is following him with all the things that they're supposed to give the chief. It might be sweet potatoes, pigs, whatever it is. And so they'll end up there at the central location. The chief then has all this stuff brought up in front of him. The guy's doing the memory, the memorization, Tongas, the data guys, recite what everyone is. They show that they're paying it. So it gets those checked off the list. The enforcers make sure no one screws around. Now you've got all this huge amount of food. You got pigs, sweet potatoes, kids crying. It's just an absolute zoo, almost literally. Now in that situation, there's no way the chief can actually eat all that food because it's going to go bad really quick. There's no way, what are you going to do with all the pigs? So what he's going to do is he wanted everyone to not have a choice. So as he marched through the valley, everyone knew they had to pay their bid. They had to pay their taxes. So as he's coming back, you end up with this big public display of the power of the chief because everyone in the valley is following him with the stuff they owe the chief. Remember politics. What he then does is he goes and he basically says to each of the families, okay, you brought in 100 pounds of sweet potato and 4 pigs. I'm going to give family A 50 pounds of potatoes and 2 pigs. So they lost. Okay. I'm going to give family B, 200 pounds of potato and 6 pigs. So they got more out of it than they came in with. Now he can just arbitrarily make these choices. Now no one can complain because there's the big bad boy standing behind them. You start to come in and whack you. Okay. So in redistribution, it's a way to show the power of the chief in this very spectacular public display of authority and power. That's how we did things here. Now, to a certain extent, if you ever get in a technical aspect, this is one of the problems the monarchy gets into, is the monarchy gets into sort of still keeps this mentality right into, maybe the 1850s, 1860s in some ways. So redistribution is a very, very effective, pretty spectacular form of power display of politics in the public zone. And here in Hawaii, the Makahiki was the classic example of this. Again, you still see this in a lot of rituals that are done both in Eastern Micronesia and most of Polynesia to honor the chief or the high person, which in many cases is not really something you have any choice in. So that's again this idea of redistribution. So sometimes you can have power by giving stuff back. So at the end of the Makahiki, the chief really doesn't have much of anything. All this stuff has been redistributed back to various families or various individuals. But what the chief has left in everyone's mind is the reality that every year he's going to march through this valley and make us cough up this stuff. And we have no say in that. And that's the power of the chief. So redistribution, some areas it's pretty esoteric. Here in the Pacific, it's just like, it's the normal way of doing business for a lot of stuff. And it's still very commonly found. Even modern politicians do this a lot in the Pacific. Which really is, when you think about it, is very different than the American view, at least most politicians. There you go. Okay, status and prestige. Status. There's 2 types of status. This should be pretty, some of the stuff will be straight. We just sort of spin through it really quick. It's really straightforward, I think. Status can be either achieved. Oh, typo there. Okay, status can either be ascribed or achieved. Sorry about that. I got to change this. So one way you can achieve status, or one way you have status, is by virtue of getting it by birth. So for example, if you're, I can't remember which of the British princes married that lady is now living in LA. He acquired his status and he's the prince of something because he got that by birth. He's the son of a prince. Yeah, son of a prince. And the, I guess it'd be, yeah, his grandmother is the queen. Yeah, sorry, I had to think about that for a second. So that's actually ascribed. So ascribed means that you get something by virtue of your birth. You don't have to work towards it. It's a given. You know, you're born the prince of blah, blah, or whatever. So ascribed status in some societies is just about how everything works. As we'll see, this is a huge part of what's called the caste system. In other societies, it's not actually all that super common. In a lot of societies, it's actually more common than people like to pretend it is. So in American society, actually a fair amount of who people are socially is actually ascribed. It's achieved by birth. If you're born to a very wealthy family, it's very likely that you're going to do better than anyone else around you. Why? Because you have access to all those resources. Oh, so-and-so is my dad or something like that. So that's actually a form of ascribed status. Achieved status is exactly what the word means. It's something that you achieve, something that you achieve or do on your own. So achieved status would be something, you know, if you become successful in sports, you become famous. That would be an example of achieved status. If you become a successful business person, like I don't think Bill Gates' family was anybody's. So in his case, that would be achieved status. It wasn't ascribed. His kids, and I don't know if he even has kids, but if his kids come to power, then in their case, a lot of it might be ascribed. Oh, you're Bill Gates' kids. So, you know, I expect if they were at school, they probably passed through Stanford. There's no way they could fail a class. So that would be achieved and ascribed. Sorry about that. I got to change this. So two versions: achieved status, ascribed status. When you think about it, you can almost judge everyone around you, everyone you've ever heard of, in terms of one of those two categories. American society loves to visualize everyone as being achieved status. The reality is a lot of American society is based on an ascribed description. Superordinate, subordinate, this again is words you're probably already familiar with. Subordinate means that someone's in a lower position than someone else. Superordinate means they're in a superior or higher position than someone else. This is oftentimes tied very closely to ascribed status. But you can also get this in achieved status. If someone is worth $1 billion, they're worth, you know, they're not only worth money-wise more than me, but if we're both registering to, you know, get a room in a hotel, it's a good bet they're going to be able to get a room and better service. Why? Because they're worth more money. As soon as the hotel figures that out, they're going to treat them differently. So superordinate and subordinate are again really straightforward. They're just, you know, the two sort of hierarchical patterns of status on people in positions of superiority and inferiority. I think in this class, I'll have to go back and check, but I think in this class we actually saw that video, the one on the Japanese, where they were talking about how you meet people. And they actually mentioned that video. If you go back and watch it, or if you remember it, you know, so they were talking about the idea of superordinate, subordinate. In Japanese language and the Japanese interact, they always make it very, very clear who's in a position of superiority and inferiority. Chinese do very much the same thing in a little more maybe subtle way. But it's a huge thing in Asian societies just to make public displays of superior and subordinate status. American society likes to sort of pretend on one hand it isn't true. But again, Americans have a very strange society in a lot of ways, as we've already seen. Lastly, social networks. Social networks occur in two ways. This is one of the classic differences between American society and, say, Japanese or Chinese society, especially Japanese society. And it's because, again, it's one of the sort of fictions of American society. Americans like to think that you can interact and hang out with anyone you want to, and actually legally you can. Socially, it's highly unlikely. What you find is the social network that most folks have in American society is based around people who are like them. So to fight the facts that people might move to different towns or different parts of a town, you'll find that they'll generally hang out with people who have the same interest, who make the same amount of money, have the same amount of education as themselves. The kids will hang out with them too, and their kids will probably marry someone in that same group. Most Americans stay in the same socioeconomic zone that they were born in. Now, they have the ability to move up and, of course, move down. But the reality is most folks don't. And that's what we call horizontal relations. Most Americans interact with a group of people who are pretty much like themselves, similar job experiences, life experiences, etc. It's not forced, but it's the reality of American society. Now, in Japanese society, it works entirely differently. Japanese society is almost entirely based on where you're born. So the neighborhood or the part of town that you're born in, we'll say, hypothetically, well, we'll just shift them here. The Japanese version of Palolo, for example, and say Hokkaido or say in Osaka or something like that. So if there's a neighborhood, everyone that lives in that neighborhood is closely intertwined because they're all born in that neighborhood. Now, that's going to be a very diverse place in terms of some people have a lot more money and have a big company. Some people have very little money and have a smaller place. But the thing that ties them together is where they're from. In fact, the sense of identity the Japanese had is called the Ie, which means that people live under the same roof. So it's not actually based on what you might think of sort of traditional kinship. It's based on place. So Japanese society is very big on place. When you go to school, the folks you go to school with, since most Japanese go to public schools, are going to be the people from the neighborhood. It's not going to be based on whether they're worth a lot of money or worth not very much money. It's the people that live around you. And you can see this if you look at Japanese neighborhoods. You'll see all sorts of, big houses, little houses, all sorts of stuff, sort of all kappa-kai mixed together. They don't have the idea of American segregated zoning. And that's because that's the way Japanese are. It's where you're from that's key. So in that context, when you're growing up, the kids that you have in your classroom, the kids you goof around with, the kids you do stuff with, are not going to be kids who have the same socioeconomic level as yourself. Some might, but it also might include some that have more than you do substantially, and it might also include folks that have significantly less than you do. But they're still the folks that you went to school with, they're still the folks from your neighborhood. So in Japanese society, Japanese grow up with the where is much more important than how much. And you see that because that's also a fairly big thing here. A large part of the population, especially in the early 20th century here, was Japanese. It's one of the biggest ethnic groups. And the Japanese brought over this attitude that where is more important than what. And you can still see this. If you go down and you look at any of the public golf courses and you watch some of the older guys playing golf, you'll find that I think golf usually is 4 people, especially as public courses because they're relatively cheap. You find the public courses will include people, if you actually ask them who's playing, is very rarely, well, 4 of them, they usually went to school together. Well, they all might have gone McKinley or Roosevelt or whatever. They're all from the same area. Oh, we're all from Momoili, they're all from Lower Punchbowl or whatever. But they're not worth the same amount of money. And that's very much the Japanese logic of things. Where you're from defines your social relationships, and your social relationships define who you hang out with. It's not based on a socioeconomic system. And that's why if you look at the older neighborhoods like Pololo to a certain extent, certainly Kaimuki, you don't see the same socioeconomic division that you out in Kapolei or Mililani, where all the houses are basically the same price. You can pretty much guess what people are just by virtue of where they live, which is a huge thing in the US mainland. Most US neighborhoods, you can literally drive through a town like LA or wherever, and pretty much guess at the socioeconomic level of the group just by virtue of what you see around you physically. And ironically, if Americans move up in terms of making more, then they move out of that neighborhood to another neighborhood. Their kids go to a different school. So horizontal relationships are how American society works. Japanese society, and to a certain extent, local society here works on vertical relations. The disadvantage of vertical relations is that you're pretty much tied by place. So it's hard to expand, your horizontal group. The advantage of vertical relationships, it's very likely that most folks have people that make more than they do, have been more successful than they do, and people that make less and are less successful. So they've got a fairly complicated network of options available to them in terms of people they can ask for favors from, or people they're supposed to do favors for that aren't part of the same socioeconomic level where you're not going to see that very much. This also makes it much more difficult for Japanese to move somewhere else, because if they move out of the neighborhood, then all of a sudden they're completely dislocated from the group. And since they don't have horizontal relationships, it's very hard to rebuild a network of people if everyone else grew up together and you're the outsider. So what you find in Japanese society is very frequently people have had to move when they were, say, from teenagers on up or as adults. They still keep very close ties with the group they grew up with, and they'll do a lot of stuff together because that's actually their group of association. So that's vertical relations. Not uncommon in Asia. Japanese are probably the best example of this. Americans are probably one of the best examples of horizontal relations. So it's a two-way developed social networks. So I'm trying to check something here. Come on, back up. Okay. Can't stop there, and I'll finish the last one, the last package next time, because it's easier to split it up here than to wait. I was trying to figure out if I could run part of this out, but let's wait. So I'll stop here. Do watch those 2 videos if you haven't already.